right. Well, if we could all come to rough order. Thanks for being here, everyone. My name is David Buckley. I'm a professor in the political science department here, and Paul Weber endowed chair of politics, science, and religion. And most relevant today, I direct the Center for Asian Democracy at the University of Louisville. I'm going to be very brief because my colleague Lisa Björkman is going to be our MC for today and is really the mastermind behind this great discussion that you've all come for. But I do want to take a minute at the very start to thank Amber Ma, while she's in the room. Thanks so much. And Joel Buno, they are our great valued partners here at Asia Institute Crane House. For those of y'all who don't know, Crane House is a very unique institution. It's one that has a mission of kind of centering Asian culture here in Louisville. And that's a very diverse mission here in the Louisville area. It's a mission that involves our Vietnamese community, our Indian community, Filipino community, and many, many more. And so we really value the chance to come up the road from U of L a little bit for this discussion today, and thank Amber and Joel for their work and partnership on this in future events. So with that said, I will happily introduce Professor Lisa Björkman.
As Professor Buckley just said, my name is Lisa Björkman, and I teach on the Faculty of Urban and Public Affairs here at University of Louisville. And it's my tremendous pleasure to welcome all of you to the Crane House for a discussion of Lisa Mitchell's brand new book, Hailing the State, Indian Democracy Between Elections. I'm going to be very brief in introducing Lisa and our three distinguished panelists today so that we can get started with an exciting discussion. Lisa Mitchell is Professor of South Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. An anthropologist and historian of Southern India, Professor Mitchell's research interests are very broad and interdisciplinary, and her methodological approach is both ethnographic and archival. Professor Mitchell's most recent book, Hailing the State, which we're going to be discussing today, tracks the multiple genealogies of democracy in India. Her earlier work traced the rise and fall of language as a category for the assertion of socio-political identity in Southern India. Her first book, Language, Emotion, and Politics in South India, The Making of a Mother Tongue, was published in 2009 with Indiana University Press and was awarded the American Institute of Indian Studies Prize in the Indian Humanities. So our discussion today is going to begin with a 25-minute presentation by Professor Mitchell, followed by responses from three discussants that will facilitate and open up to a broader discussion. So allow me to please introduce our panel today. Karl Swinehart, Professor Karl Swinehart is a linguistic anthropologist by training. Karl's in the back. An associate professor of comparative humanities here at University of Louisville. Professor Swinehart's research has looked at Aymara language radio and media activism in Bolivia during the Morales presidency, and his forthcoming monograph, which is based on that work, titled Voice and the Nation in Plurinational Bolivia, Aymara Radio and Song in an Age of Pachacuti, is being published very soon by Bloomsbury Press. Our second discussant, Professor Srimati Basu, is Professor of Gender and Women's Studies and Anthropology at University of Kentucky at Lexington. Her teaching and research interests include global feminisms, law, gender-based violence, social movements, feminist methodologies, and masculinities. At present, Professor Basu is writing a monograph on anti-feminist men's rights groups. Her two monographs, She Comes to Take Her Rights, Indian Women, Property and Propriety, and The Trouble with Marriage, Feminists Confront Law and Violence in India, both explore legacies of feminist reforms in India, and she's currently working on two other monographs, one about anti-feminist men's rights groups in India and another about Indian women private detectives. Professor David Buckley is an associate professor of political science here at U of L and the director of the Center for Asian Democracy, which is hosting us this afternoon. Professor Buckley's research has been broadly interested in the relationship between religion and democracy. His first book, Faithful to Secularism, The Religious Politics of Democracy in Ireland, Senegal, and the Philippines, was published by Columbia University Press in 2017. And the book analyzes the political life of secularism in democracies having active religious minorities. And Professor Buckley has two new book projects, a first which looks at the changing place of religion in American foreign policy, and a second exploring the role of religious institutions in responding to drug war violence in the Philippines. And it's a tremendous pleasure to bring these very different perspectives into conversation with Professor Mitchell's book, which is densely archival and ethnographic, based in southern India, and yet which has comparative and more general theoretical aspirations. So our conversation today is based in India, but aims to kind of bring broader concepts to bear on thinking about democracy more generally. So thank you very much. And I'll just signal when you have, what, 2 minutes left?
That sounds great.
Okay,
It
awesome.
looks like it's 4:08 now, so
Perfect.
I'll try to keep this maybe to 22 minutes or so. But first, let me just say thank you to all of you who are here today, especially to Lisa Björkman and Dave Buckley for the invitation, and to Joel Uno, and to Amber, and to Tori for helping make the arrangements and setting things up. And then to Srimati Basu, who's just joined us, and Karl Swinehart and Dave Buckley for agreeing to respond. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I hope that you all will ask lots of questions afterwards. In my comments, I want to do 3 things today. I first want to set the context for those of you who may not be completely familiar with India. And then I want to share a few aha moments that led me to write this book. And then I want to outline what I think the key interventions are of this book. So let me begin by setting the context. India, and as many of you may know, India is the world's largest democracy, but it is also one of the most diverse nations in the world. Not only does it have a multiplicity of religious traditions. At the time of Indian independence in 1947, India was the 2nd largest Muslim country in the world, second only to Indonesia. It has recently dropped to 3rd place after Indonesia and Pakistan, but it still is the 3rd largest Muslim country in the world, even though, as you can see, Hindus predominate in the subcontinent, but there's also many other faiths as well. It's also an intensely multilingual country. This shows the different language families, and as of currently, the Indian Constitution recognizes 22 official languages in India. And the censuses, the most recent census, I think, identified 122 major languages spoken in India, and nearly 1,600 minor languages spoken in, or other languages, less spoken languages, in the subcontinent. And I think just as a comparison, and this is actually something that interested me in my first book, is that in Europe, or virtually any place else in the world, if you had this much linguistic difference, you would have new nations. So Europe is, you know, I don't know what the difference in the geographic territory is, but, you know, each of these languages could have split off into their own country, but they didn't. They stayed together as a single nation. And I think that's something very, very interesting and unique about India. The third thing that I'll say, just to set the context, is to say that since India's independence in 1947, there's also been a long history in India of historical marginalization of particular groups, but also efforts to address that historical marginalization. And this is particularly true of groups who are defined in terms of caste and in terms of indigeneity. And just briefly, I wanted to mention the constitutional efforts to counteract historical discrimination by creating reservation quotas in government jobs and public universities in terms of admissions. And at the time of when the Indian Constitution was ratified and came into being in 1950, this included 15% reservations for those who were identified by the Constitution as scheduled castes, today known as Dalits, but formerly regarded as untouchables. Also 7.5% for scheduled tribes, or what are known in India as Adivasis, or indigenous groups. And that today they're about 16.6% of the total population of India are identifiable as Dalits, and about I think about 8% are Adivasis. Since then, in the 1990s, the reservation or the quota system was extended to other backward classes, predominantly other lower caste groups. who are today known as OBCs. And then in 2019, these reservations were extended to economically weaker sections. And I just want to quickly note that this move to extend to economically weaker sections was immensely popular, even while the total number of government jobs has been rapidly declining. And so in absolute terms, there are fewer government jobs, and although the opportunities in universities are clearly still there. The majority of the empirical work for this book comes from the South Indian city of Hyderabad and the linguistic region around there, which is a Telugu-speaking region. Telugu at the time of independence was the second most widely spoken language in India. Today it's dropped first to third, and then in the most recent census it dropped to fourth, but it's still the most widely spoken language in South India. Hyderabad, where much of this work has taken place, is today the fourth largest and fourth wealthiest city, and one of the most rapidly growing cities. It's home to High Tech City, a designated financial district, Genome Valley, which hosts all sorts of global biotech companies. The India headquarters of companies like Amazon and Facebook and Microsoft are in Hyderabad, and there have been massive highway and infrastructure projects going on for the last few decades. So it's really a center of rapid growth. Within Hyderabad and the Telugu regions that I've been doing research for the last 30 years, the material that I use for this book comes from two main contexts. The first being a linguistic state movement known as the Telangana movement. Before India gained its independence, India was a configuration of historic princely states and British-controlled territories that bore no resemblance to linguistic territories. After independence, in fact, the subject of my first book was the bid by Telugu speakers to break away from the Madras colonial presidency and form their own state. And this happened in 1953 with the creation of Andhra State, which was the first linguistic state in independent India. And then 3 years later, in 1956, there was an effort to redraw the entire map of India on linguistic lines. And during that, the part of a Telugu-speaking part of the former princely state of Hyderabad was forced into a single state with the coastal districts to make the state of Andhra Pradesh. So I say this because this sets up one of the big conflicts in the book that I look at. That region that was forced into this relationship, which is known as Telangana, never was happy with that arrangement. Even though everybody speaks Telugu, they didn't feel like they were part of the same state. And the people in Hyderabad who historically have lived in the Telangana region felt like they were colonized by the more wealthy migrants from the coastal districts who governed the media, who governed industry, who held most of the political offices. And so they felt very marginalized from the time of the creation of the state in 1956 up to 2014 when Telangana gained its independence. So that's one of the major contexts that form the basis of this book. The second are the rise of Dalit politics, or those who were formerly regarded as untouchable, and the kind of increasing mobilization in public space that Dalits have claimed over the years. And in saying that, I want to say that this is not a book about the Telangana movement or about the Dalit movement. Rather, it is a book about how citizens engage electoral representatives and as well as bureaucratic appointees who represent the state in between elections. So the goal of this book is not to document the Telangana movement or the Dalit struggle, but rather to think about how citizens engage the state. And I use the Telangana movement and the Dalit movement to illustrate this process of citizens engaging with the state. So when I teach grad students and when I help them write proposals, or when we read a book together, I'm always asking them, what are the aha moments in their research? what are those moments where you've been thinking in one way and suddenly you have an encounter or you find an archival document that changes the way you think? And so I want to, in the second part of my comments, I want to just briefly give you a few of the aha moments that I've experienced that led to writing this book. And the first of these was an interview I did with the poet and advocate for separate Telangana state, Karl Narayana Rao. I did this interview in 1997, even before I'd started my dissertation research, really. I mean, I guess you can say this was early, kind of preliminary dissertation research. And I went to the city of Warangal, which is about 100 kilometers north of Hyderabad, to meet him. The conversation I had with him that day was a transformative moment for me. I had been aware in the Telugu region in the 1910s and 20s, a movement for a new linguistic state based on Telugu had started. And I think if this is what would have been in Andhra Pradesh, the white is now the new state of Telangana that was formed in 2014, and the yellow are the coastal districts that were also Telugu speaking that formed the initial separate linguistic state in 1953. And this was the culmination of efforts that had started in the 1910s and 20s to create a separate linguistic state. And at the same time, there was also a movement afoot that was known as the spoken Telugu movement. And this was a movement where advocates, it's always been historicized as a liberal effort to extend written Telugu, to extend written language to a more mass population so that literacy was easier to acquire. Written Telugu in the 1910s and 20s was classical. It was very different from what people spoke. And so it was challenging to acquire. And so the movement in the 1910s and 20s, there was a movement to create a spoken form of written Telugu, or a written form of spoken Telugu, actually, that would be easier for people to learn. And it was to make written Telugu more closely resemble spoken Telugu. And it had always been historicized as this liberal effort, very positively historicized, to extend written language to a wider population and make literacy easier to acquire. When I met Kalaji, I discovered that there was a different way of thinking about the spoken Telugu movement. And I want to just read a bit from the book. And this is a verbatim from my recording with him. He's describing to me a child from Telangana reading from a Telugu primer. And he says the child began reading and then abruptly stopped. Again, he repeats, Rozu kaki metaku, Rozu kaki metaku. Every day, the crow to the grazing pasture. And then the child stops. And I say, why is it that you're not finishing the sentence? And what is that? And I took away the book from him. It is written there. Rozu kaki metaku veledi. Every day the crow went to the grazing pasture. And no person, except for those educated classes of the 2 or 3 communities from coastal Andhra, no child says veledi. Different usage is different in different places. Poyedi, potadi. The person from Warangal or Telangana, they'll say potadi. Rozu kaki metaku potadi. He will never say veledi. It's difficult for him to say veledi and write veledi. When he writes in his examinations, if he writes potadi, the persons who are at the helm of affairs and the teachers and the examiners, they will say this is wrong. Principally, the child is correct when he writes potadi. So what he's pointing to is linguistic variation that makes it very difficult for children from this region to acquire the new written spoken Telugu. He goes on and he says it's not just that the Telangana dialect is seen as substandard and erroneous. He actually goes on to point out the way in which speakers from his region, from the Telangana region, have effectively been silenced in public space. Their voices are inaudible. And he goes on and he says, there's Balanandan, a children's program on the radio. Balanandan, in every week, 3, 4, 5 times it airs. And in every Balanandan episode, 30, 25, 30 children partake. But the person who's at the desk, who's in charge of the Balanandan, lady or gentleman, they are from the coastal districts. So again, during these 40 years, at least 20 to 30 lakhs. So what is that? I always have to 2 to 3 million, yeah, children, yeah, 2 to 3 million were a part of this Balanandan radio program. And I tell you a challenge that not a single child, girl or boy, from these 22 districts, except those 2 or 3 communities from Krishna and Guntur. Yeah, so Krishna and Guntur, also sometimes the Godavari districts are included, and it's only the upper caste groups in those communities that speak that variety that was made into written Telugu. So I tell you a challenge. Not a single child has ever been heard on the program, except for children from these districts, and that too upper caste. So they have an advantage. For the last 40 years, they have led. Of all the disadvantages created in the linguistic grouping, this is the greatest disadvantage. We have been thrown back hundreds of years. So for every radio program in all those stations, any story recited, any poem recited, any essay, broadcast, any program, a drama, anything is in the spoken language of the educated classes of those 2 districts in coastal Andhra. That too, not the entire population of the 2 districts is represented. So this is the 2 or 3 communities, educated classes, groups against the entire population of the state. So this was a really pivotal moment in how I thought about language and the public sphere. A second aha moment, I'd always been struck. I first went to India in the late 80s as my junior year abroad. And I was really struck by how vibrant public space was and how many political processions and meetings in public spaces. And I kind of taken that for granted. And then in the late 1990s, a good friend of mine from Hyderabad came to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to do her PhD in sociology. And we were talking on the phone shortly after she arrived, and she happened to comment that student stipends for PhD stipends were taxable in the United States. And I was like, oh yeah, that happened during the Reagan administration. They made student stipends taxable. And her response was, didn't students protest? And when she said that, I suddenly was struck by an absolute truth, that in the US, maybe students protested. I don't remember it, but maybe I wasn't old enough to see that. But in India, anything like that, you'd have students up in arms, and it would not have been passed. It would have been rescinded if they tried to make tuition taxable. So this public space occupation goes way back. It goes back to Gandhi, and it actually goes far, much further back. And this is part of what I try to demonstrate in the book, is that the kinds of public space political practices that we see in India today have long, long histories that predate even colonialism. And then I want to just add one or two more quick experiences. Actually, I'm going to skip this one and just go to another experience I had. It was in the city of Chennai in Tamil Nadu in South India, going on my way in a car to the Tamil Nadu State Archives. And we came to a very busy intersection, and our car kind of stopped. And I got out to see why we were stopped. And there were 20 or 30 women sitting in the middle of this busy intersection. It's like 8 or 8:30 in the morning. Parents were trying to drop kids to various schools that surrounded this intersection. There was an absolute stoppage of traffic. And it turned out that the chief minister of the state had promised families whose huts had been destroyed in the previous November in Cyclone Nisha, a certain amount of rehabilitative funds to rebuild their houses. And these women, it was mostly women in the intersection, had gone from pillar to post, from office to office, trying to make good that promise. And everybody had sent them to different offices, and they were so frustrated that they finally decided they're going to sit down in this intersection until they got some response from the government. And so this was another example of just this kind of use of public space to communicate with the state and have the state fulfill a promise that they had made. So I want to then turn to my theoretical interventions, what I think the book is trying to do. One of the things, as I was writing this book and doing the research, there was a radical resurgence of interest in collective assembly in the wake of the Occupy movement and also the Arab Spring, both of which saw large numbers of people in public space. And a bit ironically, some of the largest public collective assemblies that have ever occurred, not just in India, but in the world, have actually occurred almost simultaneous with these very, both Occupy movement and the Arab Spring. So on December 16th in 2010, there was a Mahajana Garjana, which means a great roar of people, a public outdoor gathering to make known the support for a separate Telangana state. This incidentally happened one day before the vegetable vendor in Tunisia. The incident happened with him that launched the Arab Spring. So this happened the day before, literally the day before that incident with the vegetable vendor. And a year later, on September 12th, 2011, 5 days before the Occupy movement was launched on Wall Street in New York, was a second massive demonstration. It's hard to estimate numbers. I've seen anything from 1.2 to 2.5 million for these gatherings. Crowd statistics are notoriously difficult, so I'm not going to make any claims about their size, but they were at least as large, probably far larger than Tahrir Square or the Occupy movement. They received virtually no international coverage. Now, part of that might be because these gatherings were actually not resisting the state. They were not rejecting the authority and the sovereignty of the Indian state. Instead, they were appealing to it, and even more importantly, they were asking the state, the elected officials, to hold good on their repeated promises to create the new state of Telangana. This promise was first made in 1999. During the 1999 general elections, the BJP-led National Democratic Alliance had campaigned on the promise to create 4 new states. 3 of the 4 were created, Telangana was not. And this is really what launched this. And so part of what I wanted to show in the book is that this was not a rejection of the authority of the state. It was not a rejection of the sovereignty of the state. The way that most collective assemblies in public space tend to be theorized. This was instead an attempt to hold elected governments accountable to what they had promised during their campaigns. And so it was very much a negotiation and a relationship with the state. Let's see, I think we're at about 22 minutes. So I think maybe I guess what I'll just stop, I'll just stop here, I think, and say that the second kind of major intervention that the book is trying to make is that most of the theorizing of democracy today tends to focus on deliberative democracy. How can we create environments where everybody's voices are heard? The anecdote from Kalaji Narayana Rao, I think, really illustrates the fact that in many contexts, not everybody's voices are able to be heard. So how then do we understand deliberative democracy in a context in which not everyone's voices are able to be heard? And so as a result of trying to think through this, the book focuses on forms of engagements in public space that are efforts to make voices heard. Things like sit-in demonstrations and hunger strikes. I'll just very quickly go through these images so you get a picture in your mind. Efforts to gain an audience with an elected official, which we can call darshan, viewing, or there's a tradition of grievance days, often weekly grievance days in collectors' offices. Government offices are set up to host, much like this, to host people who are trying to meet with them. Public meetings, outdoor public meetings, strikes. And then the second part of the book tries to think about the relationship between colonial bans on certain kinds of practices or things that might be constructed as criminal that then are redefined as political. Things like alarm chain pulling in Indian railways to stop a train for political purposes in order to send a message to New Delhi. Things like road and rail blockades, stopping trains, again, to send a message to New Delhi, to the central government. Stopping buses in roads is a way to send a message to the state government. Buses are controlled by states, railways are controlled by the central government. And then ticketless travel, processions, and political pilgrimages. And I'll just kind of end with some of these images just so you get a sense of what happens in the Indian political space. Thank you.
I'd like to invite our distinguished panelists, the discussants, to take their seats, and in an arbitrary order, so we can do. Yeah, so Professor Swinehart on the end, and Professor Buckley and Professor Basu, I have you here next to Professor Mitchell. Rather arbitrary, but let's just begin with Professor Swinehart, and then we'll have Professor Basu, and then wrap up with Professor Buckley. You each have 7 to 8 minutes. I'll give you a sign when you have 2 minutes left. Does that work?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. I mean, thanks to the Center for Democracy for bringing Dr. Mitchell. Thank you so much. Björkman for pulling this together. My background is not in South Asia. My research background is in South America, primarily in Bolivia. And it's not in political anthropology per se, but in more in media anthropology. But I am so grateful for this book. We should have come out before during the finals. It's on my graph, because the parallels and resonances with the case of Bolivia, where I've been doing my research and thinking over the last 15 years, are many, and really it's very, very generative for thinking about a very different corner of the world. And in particular, Mitchell's work is really provocative for expanding the realm of what's viewed as communicative, political, and I think a really important and earnest intervention for thinking through people who are often dismissed as either being outside or maybe even antagonistic to democratic initiatives, right? The crowd, the masses, being kind of outside of reason or rationality. And instead taking very seriously these political interventions like blocking off roads, pulling a train to have it stop, and other forms of mass political action. And this is another place where there's a lot of resonance with Bolivia also. So I'll just speak around in my notes a little bit. Before I'm done, I want to talk about roadblocks. Well, let's do it now. Roadblocks in Bolivia. Well, no, I'm going to back up. So we'll get to roadblocks in Bolivia in a second. But it's some of the aha moments for me thinking about media anthropology and this work in Bolivia. I need to think about roads and railways within the realm of thinking about communicative study and media studies. That seems pretty unconventional, right? To include infrastructure within under the rubric of media studies. And I would encourage people or anyone. This is not a crowd of anthropologists, but or linguists, but an early figure in my field, Edward Sapir, has a really wonderful essay called Communication from 1931, Encyclopedia of Social Sciences. And he's in this, he includes very early on the railroad, the telegraph, the telephone. The radio and airplane are among the best examples of communicative structures. It is to be noted that such instruments as the railroad are not communicative in character as such. They become so only because they facilitate the presentation of types of stimuli which act as symbols of communication and which contain implications of communicative significance. Again, the fact that a railroad runs me from a certain point is of no real communicative importance unless there are fixed bonds of interest which connect me to the inhabitants of the other place. But even the idea that it could be stopped, not just in getting someone from point A to point B, but the fact that this is a sign of communication and a sign of that fixed bond between people makes it a site of important political action potentially. And so in Bolivia, where roadblocks, they've been very much a sort of central part of Bolivia's powerful social movement repertoire, have been they're called bloqueos, but they're also called huelgas. So when roadblocks happen to shut down the country, they're often talked about not as roadblocks, but as strikes, right? And the synonymy between a roadblock and a blockade and a strike, instead of thinking about a strike is happening at the site of production, but at the site of distribution, right? To the arteries of national commerce, and that to call people who are shutting down roads as mobilistas, as strikers, is something that was always kind of interesting to me. But similarly, maybe thinking in sort of rethinking how these are communicative, that that the sort of not for the supporters of these strikes, but for the opposition, they're viewed as anti-democratic, that this is anti-deliberative. But instead to understand this as part of a different genealogy of deliberative democracy, and not as an anti-democratic impulse, but one that in Bolivia, and as Mitchell was pointing out, in India as well, there's a deep genealogy both among indigenous Aymaras and Quechuas in terms of community deliberation and decisions to participate in events like this, but also of union militancy and of union democracy. So it's not in any way antagonistic to notions of deliberative democracy, and in fact, I can say pretty confidently, always the result of community deliberation and political engagement. Mitchell, the title itself, talking about hailing, flips the model of the Althusserian model of interpretation, that rather than the state that is like a cop on the street saying, "Hey, you," that is the citizen to the citizen or the passerby. She's looking at moments when it's the citizen saying to the state, "Hey, you," and in the process, hailing the state as an entity, and she's problematizing also, I think in an important way, a kind of discursive determinism that lurks in the Althusserian model of the cop calling the citizen and interpolating that the interpolating act itself alone does not constitute a subject, right? When a cop says to someone on the street, "Hey, you," the person might walk away, the person might not hear them or ignore them, or there's always, this is an insight from linguistic anthropology, that, meaning happens retrospectively. It's not just in the speech act, the first part of the speech act, there's a second part, right? And what Mitchell is recognizing is that the first turn of talk, the "hey, you," is meaningful retrospectively through its a subsequent uptake. So just kind of flipping that around and looking at citizens doing this to the state, not just the state to citizens. There's 2 minutes, I was told. So Mitchell also joins Nancy Fraser and others in critiquing sort of idealized Habermasian view of the public sphere. She departs from Fraser, looking beyond the counter-public notion, one tied to some cultural difference, and different styles of political engagement as being different styles of politics, and instead looks at failures of recognition. Quote in part from Fraser by arguing that some of the differences that have been assumed to be differences in style have instead been produced through failures of recognition. So on that, I guess, in thinking about the different kinds of responses or ways of hailing the state, or like how interpolation might happen, from subjects to the state. You point out, you move between the Tongana movement that, as you said in the introduction, was one trying to get state, not just state recognition, but a new state, right? Within Native studies, and there's been a lot of discussion about refusal rather than just recognition itself. And so one question, in terms of, is it only? I don't think it's only in moments of sort of hailing a state that there's also deliberation and democratic possibility. But what about other kinds of, like if there's refusal and ignoring of these? We think about Occupy, one of the wonderful parts of your book, I think, is the way that not listening and not hearing is constructed on the part of powerful people. And I think we saw this very much in Occupy, where there was this sort of insistence on the inarticulate nature of the movement, when many people were very clear in what they wanted. Absolutely. So there's so how we can think about other kinds of not just the hailing, but and the recognition, but how might refusal figure into thinking about these processes. I'm going to stop there. I have some other notes. I guess. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Professor Basu?
Oh, okay.
No.
All right. Hi. Let me start by thanking Lisa Björkman for arranging this wonderful event, for inviting me, and Buckley and the staff of the Crane Center for the arrangements and the place of the book in the Crane Center lineup, and to Lisa Mitchell for visiting the Bluegrass and for writing this book. His books are, very entertaining and very erudite, full of very lively and passionate rabble rousers, and interspersed with the ghosts of Basu and our masses alive. I should say that I've had so many discussions with Lisa about having a gerund in the title, so hailing. And I am now convinced that it is very, very core to the argument. Won me over. But now I think my favorite word in the title is between, which is the preposition, because it is about democracy between elections and all of the work that is done in the between. So those of you following US politics will notice we are constantly in the between right now. So, and another of my favorites is the travel metaphors that encompasses so many domains of politics. So the book has political arrival as an important concept, creating a town, as Karl mentioned, the chain pulling on trains, sitting so that others might move towards you. There is a thing called village on the train and village on the tracks or whatever, which is involved, eating your lunch on the trains. Well, so I wanted to share with you on a different note 3 kind of rather personal frameworks through which I did this. So first, I went to undergraduate college in Kolkata in India, on a college that prided itself on its political history. So there was a grand central stairway that had a sign warning us not to sit there, which, we took great delight in sitting there. So these stairs were mythically famous for, as those which this fiery leader, Subhash Chandra Bose, had pushed the British administrator down on in this picturesque act of anti-colonial defiance. So so that was one history. In the smoky college canteen, what do you call it? Canteen. Yes. Cafeteria. Alongside the canteen, intense with laughter and argument and spontaneous singing and intense silences around these very fervent chess players. There were these older Naxalite leaders who were mythical figures to us from a decade and a half ago. They were revolutionaries of a movement that was part of an armed movement that was seen to have failed. But to us, they were still figures of awe and daring and suffering. So the dharna, by the way, was a seamless part of our social lives on the street. The lunch hour was often occupied by a ghirav or dharna, or surrounding the president's office with our various demands. Traffic on the street we were on was often at a standstill from political processions. It's part of our sonicscapes. And then I remember going next door to the university offices because I needed something, and they were going through a series of strikes, so no one would give us the paperwork we wanted. And I threatened there to have my own sit-down strike at the desk until they gave me something. And to my astonishment, it worked. So, so this Lisa's huge canvas of social movements, from hunger strikes to human chains, recalled for me how these individual moments were imagined, through decades of other protests, as she says. Here, no doubt, colored by my, Bengali middle class, foundational romanticism of a rebellion. So I love seeing these experiences through her work as part of a habitus, to use Bourdieu's word of politics, right? A habitus that is learned in osmosis and diffusion of political protests as a way of being subjects and citizens and profoundly political beings. I'll ask you maybe my question on the strike chapter if we have time. We'll skip that since folks are about to read that. So note here that one of the really important points she makes is both our identities and our social locations affect whose claims are heard, right? Sometimes perfunctorily they're heard in these promises to do something, or in the lethal version that we in universities are familiar with, to form a committee to do something. So second, they are claims are heard through just transactional political listening. So Lisa has some very wonderful ethnographic work where she compellingly demonstrates that. My favorite, as Karl mentioned, is the reversal of the Althuserian hailing by the COP, in which people, in Lisa's work, people recognize the state through the ways they are addressing it. And the state hails right back, right? So often making space for political speech, not just through managed speech zones that you saw some of, which then become important. So there are places where people meet, which then they become important public spaces of gathering and social unrest. I mean, I remember going to Jantar Mandir in Delhi for a series of protests around this act to bar sexuality, to criminalize same-sex sex, through, you know, when the case was won, when the case was lost, and that itself becomes a social space. But the remarkable tactic of that she describes of designating train coaches for ticketless train travel, where the state recognizes that, right? Thereby both noticing them and not directly hearing them. So, so Lisa's arguments around political arrival, that is, who can be seen to have been recognized by the state or to have a political grievance, and how the state grants favor towards protesters, it believes to be properly civic and civil, is one of the concepts most useful to me in my current monograph underway. So I'm trying to write about an anti-feminist men's rights movement, and the ways in which it tries to achieve respectability, right? It tries to get a hearing about political injustice. It's trying to overcome their reputation as either objects of ridicule or as a batterer movement. So they're trying everything from street protests to, as impoverished men in these thin towels, to this dramatic mass Hindu funeral ceremony that mourns the death of marriage. To applications to be a human rights group using UN criteria, to have a men's ministry parallel to the Women's and Children's Ministry and Development Ministry that exists. So I've been tracing how they see this movement through building habits of writing grievance letters, or developing a saturation of discourse through blogs, or gathering people for parliament visits. So I think Lisa shows us that they are hailing away and occasionally succeeding in getting noticed by using these established repertoires of protest. I'll skip the books that I feel this is in conversation for me, and just go to a little bit at the end, where Lisa writes of recognizing the importance of civility, not as a feature of individual comportment and as a precondition for democratic participation, but rather as a product of structures of authority that facilitate the recognition of political subjects and give audience to their voice. So, clearly it says, those who find that they are recognized then have the luxury of appearing to be more civil. They can speak more calmly and quietly, etc. So I thought, so someone is humanized or someone is erased, so that sentence, just to tell you, so it seems impossible to think about political recognition and civility and who is humanized and who is erased in sort of this moment in our political times, especially through the frames through which colonial violence continues to be represented without thinking of where we are in these last 2 weeks. So Lisa, I was struck by how differently and viscerally I read your chapter on civility and recognition last year versus now, right? So just to name my position, I live by default complicity as a post-colonial subject in a settler colonial state, which is, smugly, according to me, funding one of the most cruel and surreal forms of European settler colonial genocide that we've seen. So to me, it is a reminder that colonizers, or in post-colonial states in India, I would say there is sort of autocratic administration with theocratic intent. So you can see that in the movements, you can see movements in how Kashmir is represented. So how these states get to frame everyday pleasures and harm and politics. Thank you.
As the resident political scientist, I guess, on the panel, but also not South Asianist, right? It was fascinating to engage with a project that had a lot to say to some of the major literatures in comparative politics right now, which is my subfield, and the sort of comparative study of democracy. So I'll give a couple of thoughts on that, of sort of direct interventions or times when I, as reading the book, said, yes, right, that this is what we are wrestling with, right? Maybe with different methodological tools, but with similar substance. And then I ask a few questions coming from some of my work. I think actually that a lot of the work that you're doing here fits really comfortably with some of the work in comparative politics now on democratic backsliding. I'm sure you know this literature pretty well. The idea that democracy is having a tough time around the world right? Here in the US, in a number of international cases. And that a lot of this, though, is happening outside of electoral contexts, right? You can have very healthy electoral institutions in a country. You can have votes that are counted on election day in a relatively meaningful way, right? While still not getting at the substance of the real health of a democracy in a country, right? Now, for comparativists who study this stuff, we tend to look at things like checks on executive, right? So, like, are the courts still independent of executive dominance? Does the legislature still have the ability to, with any autonomy, pass laws related to the transfer of power, that sort of thing? We might look at constraints on media, right? Not these days usually just murdering journalists, although sometimes, but also kind of informal coercion through licensing requirements, through capitalistic ownership of media on the open market by the regime, that sort of thing. And we certainly look at closing space for civil society, right? Targeted harassment of civil society activists from all sorts of vulnerable communities or sources of political opposition. So those are the kinds of indicators that in comparative politics, we've gotten pretty used to studying. So in the Philippines is the case that I study the most closely, where this is going on very actively, right? And all of these things have happened. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was forced out. The leader of the political opposition was thrown in prison without charges. The license was pulled from the most important TV network in the country for no reason. And criminal charges were brought against the Nobel Peace Prize winning journalist, right? Okay. When I'm reading your book, on the one hand, a lot of this is very comfortable, actually, right? Because it is the between the elections. It's not, you're consistently saying, don't just focus on the procedures of the election, right? And yet I found myself curious because at the same time, you are showing how healthy actually a lot, at least in a lot of ways, but my read on this is that there's actually a very vibrant pattern of localized communities that are still quite effective, actually, even in an environment where we see some of these formal kind of national level indicators, especially, right, weakening. You document communities that are really pretty good from positions of weakness at getting their point across. Not that they always win, but that at least they kind of engage in sustained, costly collective action. And so I found myself curious thinking about, as somebody who does work ethnographically and super close to the ground, what indicators of the health of a non-electoral, what non-electoral indicators of the health of a democracy would you track right? Not in a quantitative way necessarily, right? Yeah, it could be generalized from the state where you're drawing this. But I thought that was just super thought-provoking in the report. The other piece of this that I just loved was and I'm gonna read one quote here. It's much easier for bureaucrats, elected representatives, and even elites more generally to dismiss or ignore the communicative efforts of those who are seen as rejecting their authority than it is to dismiss those who are recognized as embracing the legitimacy and responsibilities of those who formally represent them. So the element of the mobilization in this book and the distinction that you make several times between sort of what we might in political science call contentious politics that's focused on sort of overthrowing the state. That for the most part, that's not what you're studying. It can be quite contentious, but you're consistent in saying that a lot of this claims making is not meant to overthrow the state. It's not meant to say down with the system. It's meant to say the system needs to operate more justly or according to the standards that it should hold itself to. And that really resonated with some of the work that I've done close to the ground in the Philippines related to the drug war there and Duterte's sort of implementation of it. I went into that work, talk about aha moments. I went into that work thinking, okay, I'm going to go document how local sort of human rights communities are sort of like sticking it to the man, for lack of a better word, right? Are like really confronting police and like holding them accountable. And some of that does go on, right? But the actual lived reality that I found was often much closer to what I think you document here, local actors mobilizing not necessarily certainly not to overthrow the government and not even necessarily to challenge the need for police, but to say, you're not abiding by procedures that should be abided by, or we can document these things and making claims, right, through positive collective action. And that is a story that it involves confrontation, but it's different than, like you said, a kind of revolutionary logic. I just thought that really resonated with some of the things that I've observed, not ethnographically, but at least close to the ground in the Philippine case. Let me just wrap up with a couple of questions, maybe that came across my mind here in the last couple of minutes. I was curious as I read this. So, as a political scientist who studies religion and democracy, if I know one thing about the Indian case, it's okay, sort of right-wing Hindu nationalism has taken over the national level of the country. I know there's massive state-by-state variation, right? The growth of Hindu nationalism at the national level was kind of on the edges of your story a number of times. I am curious if you think actually that national level change has really actually changed the nature of this local mobilization that you charted in the project. Sometimes it seemed like yes, but actually at other times I wasn't sure whether you saw that as actually a meaningful change. The other thing that I was really struck by in the research here was how much just costly sometimes economically, but also just symbolically, collective action was going on in here from communities that were vulnerable and not particularly materially powerful. And I was curious, why don't people quit? Where does the sense of agency of these individuals come from? Because I was blown away by the efficacy that you're finding in communities who we might expect to not feel very self-efficacious at all, right? And to actually withdraw from politics and to say, why would I pull this chain on this train? It's not going to do it. My life is kind of set. And so I'm curious about where you find the sense of efficacy coming from in these communities. What sustains that in the face of failure or long time horizons, right? Because you're not always talking about people who win the argument that day, not at all, but they seem to stay engaged. And then kind of related to that is you talk some about this, but the question of sort of why on the state level side, on the street level bureaucrat side of things, what they get out of being hailed, right? And it's sort of the legitimacy that they derive from it. There might be a material story. You talk about kind of it makes their governance more effective in some ways, maybe lines of communication. But I think there's probably a moral logic too, a kind of appropriateness. It's their role, it's their moral duty to be hailed, not to like give people everything, but there's a kind of role being played here. I just thought it was very fascinating. So I'll wrap up there, and thanks so much for being here.
Given the high seat, yes.
So, do you wanna, I'm sure you could probably give another 3 lectures in response to these remarks, but do you wanna take 5 minutes or so and
And
respond, and then we can open it up for?
whatever you think.
That's fine, yeah, I think we've got about 20 minutes for, 15 minutes for open discussion, so.
Well, maybe I'll just first of all, thank you for the close engagement and the fantastic comments and questions. I've learned so much from all 3 of you. And I guess maybe I'll just start with Karl's question about refusal, and which I think relates to quite a few different parts of the argument, but I think I think you're right to point out that the goal of the Telangana state activists was a separate state. It wasn't separation from India, but it was a separate state, administrative state within the Indian Union. And so there is a little bit of tension there between, are they rejecting the current structure of the state? And isn't that a kind of rejection of the existing sovereignty and a demand for a different structure of sovereignty? And so I think one of the ways that I would think about that is that there, well, I guess 2 things. One is that I think there's a spectrum of ways of engaging the state. And certainly India is also famous for the Naxalite movement, which is an explicitly Maoist movement. In fact, India is one of the few places in the world where Maoism is still alive and very, very well. And people in Hyderabad still debate the role of violence and whether violence is appropriate or not. And most significantly, the Maoist movements in India do not engage with elections. They boycott elections.
Mhm.
And so that is an example of explicitly rejecting the sovereignty of the state. And I think, and I certainly acknowledge that, I see that's there, and I think there's a spectrum between rejecting the electoral politics and just not participating. And certain Dalit movements have also, the Dalit Panthers in Tamil Nadu have in the past boycotted and then later started to participate and even stand for elections. So I think there is a spectrum, but I also think that there's a difference between so one of the things I was writing against was a prominent trend in anthropology in particular to romanticize anarchism. And everyone from James Scott to David Graeber and other authors have kind of and even a lot of commentators on the Occupy movement kind of romanticized this leaderless uprisings, and this idea that true mobilization is leaderless, and that really anarchy and the lack of a leader is really what our goal is somehow. And I've never understood that. I don't see it in the Indian context. These are not spontaneous uprisings. They are well organized, as you say, they're built on community consensus often. Not necessarily state consensus, but community consensus. And so, it's hard for me to envision what a leaderless, stateless, society would look like. And so to me, those have never been particularly constructive. And when I was talking to my interlocutors, and I started to realize that, hey, this is not people asking for an outright, rejection. Instead, they want it structured in a way that's more effective. And so I think, I guess I would just say that there is a kind of refusal, but it's not an outright refusal in this case. It's not a demand for anarchism. Srimati, and by the way, thank you for this up here. Edward said here quote, which is fantastic. I wish that I could have incorporated that. Srimati, your comment about habitus of politics raises a question that you didn't articulate, but that I'm going to articulate because it kind of underlies many of your comments. And that is this idea that India is exceptional, it's different, and that people just imbibe with the water these ways of being in the world that lend themselves to being political. And so that raises the question is India unique, am I just documenting a way of being in the world that's different from every place else in the world? Or, and I would lean toward the second, can we learn something from it? And can we use the case of democracy between elections in India to think differently and frame different questions about democracy in the United States, about democracy in Europe, about democracy in in all over the world, and authoritarianism. But can we ask different questions? And can we not start from an assumption that collective assembly in public space is resistance.
Mm.
And really ask, what is going on in this collective assembly? What are the goals of this collective assembly? Who are people addressing themselves to? Because the audiences are not always the same. Sometimes it's the state, sometimes it's not the state. Sometimes it's publics, it's other publics, it's not state representatives, not elected officials. And so part of what I'm advocating in this is a method where we start to not homogenize collective assemblies in public space, but think carefully. And actually, Lisa Björkman's work has also shown this, that not all collective assemblies in public space are the same, even if they look like they're the same, because they have different goals and they're addressing different audiences. And then Dave, you've got so many wonderful questions, but I'm going to pick the one that I think, and maybe we can address some of the others in more general discussion, but the non-electoral indicators of the health of democracy. I think that's a brilliant question. And I have two ways of answering that. One is to talk about all of the ways that space for collective assembly has been restricted during the current administration, but also ways that groups have been successful. So I want to start with the closing down of spaces in the city of Hyderabad. One of the first kind of contexts that I worked in is a space in Hyderabad called Dharna Chowk, which is literally means something like sit-in intersection or corner. And it's a designated public assembly space. When it was created in the mid-1990s, it was a bid by the then chief minister to move political activity away from the state secretariat. The main protest space used to be a park directly opposite the entrance to the state secretariat. And that chief minister was in the midst of kind of like modernizing Hyderabad and building flyovers, and political activity got in the way of the movement of traffic. And so he moved it to a back street. And then in 2016, a different chief minister, one who had actually headed a party that helped to bring Telangana into being, he tried to move Dharna Chowk about 20 kilometers out to the outskirts of the town, next to the municipal garbage dump. And there was widespread protest against this. Like, what? You can't have a protest space on the outskirts. It's got to be in the center of town, even if it's now a kilometer or two away from the state secretariat. It's still central, and it's still important to have that distance. And they were successful in getting the courts to reinstate the use of that space in the center. Similar things have happened in New Delhi. Jantar Mantar is the designated protest space there. There have also been efforts to shut that down. And so we've seen a kind of heightened arrest, much more rampant arrest of civil society activists. And this kind of closing down of public space. So freedom of speech is really, I think, in jeopardy in India right now. At the same time, we have the example of the farmers' protests of a few years ago. The current administration had passed a series of farm laws without putting them through parliament. It was a kind of, they were basically announced without going through parliament. And farmers rallied and came to the national capital, blockaded many of the roads going in, held parades of their, processions with their bullock carts, through the streets, and was successful over a period of many months in getting the new farm laws overturned and in demanding that the government hold true to promises that it had previously made to support farmers. So there is evidence of sustained a really big movement of the ability to still. Now, whether that continues is I think the big question. So I'd love to address the others, but we can do that afterwards. But thank you.
Fantastic. We have about 10 minutes of open discussion. And you know what I think we should do is let's collect a couple of questions or comments or interventions, and then you can respond.
And we will also have time downstairs to have snacks.
Yeah, we're gonna have some.
Just talking.
And we hope you'll stay.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about the non-electoral indicators of the democracy. I'm thinking the Telangana movement has been going on for a long time, 1910, 20s, you mentioned. So there is a momentum to it, and it got formed very recently, 2014. And since then, Hyderabad, we showed that has had a lot of corporate headquarters of these big techs coming in. Microsoft, Facebook, Google, Amazon, might involve in major mass media, I would imagine for a corporate player, a new state would be uncertain ground, but that's not the case here. They might have gone to Bangalore, which is also close by, a tech city, or Gujarat, the current prime minister's home state, which he tries to get corporates into. So the question is there something about the momentum that's built up that's probably spilling over or not into market dynamics here, or the rule of law in general?
Yeah. That's a great question. Do we want to collect a few?
Good. Is there another one right now? Yeah, please.
So, yeah, thank you all. I mean, that's wonderful. That I really learned a lot from you and from the commentators. So, without having read your book, kind of peers, the title of Building the State. The state, I don't know how you look at state. The state is something that is, quite homogeneous and coherent, and even this almost something that is quite different. If I look at that, it seems that these protesters from poverty, when they call them, that they're engaging with the national government, whereas refugees maybe the fiction of the local state. So they, how would you, conceptualize that? It's state, Indian states, is something more homogeneous and coherent, or I think that is actually whatever. Whether you get engaged at levels of lots of the state.
Thank you for that. Great. Yeah.
Can we take one more question? Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so, okay, in what ways does the Indian state have administrative legitimacy capacity to productively work through potential polarization around mass political participation movements? And how is this administrative capacity shifted in the context of the formal political process facing the forces of marginalization and elite action?
Should we take those three or?
Should we have we had another question? Yeah, please.
Just wanted to ask, what forces are threatening the freedom of speech? And who is it that is actively working for this space?
Okay, great. Let me answer these four, and then we'll get to these are great. These are great questions. All four questions are fantastic. Let me start with the first question about the relationship, and actually, there's a little bit of a. Your question also was about market forces, so maybe I'll put those two questions together. How do we understand the kind of corporate players and the market capitalism, and this kind of public space democracy between elections that might be seen as somewhat threatening to market forces? And I think in terms of thinking about why Hyderabad, why are all these corporate headquarters in Hyderabad? I actually think a lot of the credit has to go to Chandrababu Naidu, who was the chief minister, up until an earlier chief minister, who did a number of things that were really unique. One is that he, when he was chief minister of the United Andhra Pradesh, that include both Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, he is, by the way, also from coastal Andhra originally. One of the things that he did was he was the first example of an Indian state to take a World Bank loan directly without going through the central government. So he borrowed, he did a World Bank deal directly rather than most states did it via the central government. The other thing that he did is he courted, powerful state leaders and people like Bill Gates and established direct relationships with the city. So he was definitely on a mission to make Hyderabad into what then was Bangalore. There was a phrase that he used. He wanted to make it into the next Singapore. He used Singapore kind of as a model. And it was under Chandrababu Naidu, the same chief minister, that the designated protest space was created a couple kilometers away from. And so, you can see that as an attempt to kind of constrain public space protest, and he wanted it, he moved it to a back road where no one ever goes. It's not a main thoroughfare. And at the time, people were outraged. They were like, what? How can you move Dharna Chowk away from the state secretariat? But over the course of a few years, as people began to realize that media would cover whatever happened at Dharna Chowk, people grew used to it, and other cities started to demand their own Dharna Chowks, their own designated assembly spaces. And people kind of forgot their outrage that it had moved and embraced that space. And so he allowed a space for protest, but he moved it away from the thoroughfares of commerce and of development and of the building of flyovers and, you know, multi-lane highways and things like that. So, and I think there is a kind of historical momentum. Part also of what made Hyderabad such a site of contestation is that people like Chandrababu Naidu and all media leaders, all were migrants from coastal Andhra. So people who, you know, were originally from the Telangana region felt like they were not participating in the rapid economic growth that the city was experiencing. So in many ways, you could say that if Hyderabad had not been so successful, people in Telangana might not have been so invested in regaining control of the city. One of the big issues with the partition of the new state in 2014 was where the capital was going to be. And one of the possible solutions was that Hyderabad would be a shared capital between both states, even though it's not very close to coastal Andhra. That ultimately was rejected, and actually it's been kind of comical because in Andhra, the coastal Andhra, which now Andhra Pradesh, there have been several elected parties who have proposed different cities. In fact, when Chandrababu Naidu was chief minister of the new state, he had created a designated, a new city kind of outside of Vijayawada, but a new space where there's rampant land speculation in the wake of this announcement. And then he lost power and they moved the capital away. So all those people who bought land around Amravati, this new capital, now are like, this is a wasted investment because the capital's not going to be here now. And it's not fully settled where the capital is going to be. At one point they were proposing 3 capitals in coastal Andhra, but there's no kind of density of economic power the way there is in Hyderabad. So I don't know if that answers, you know, both of those, but you know, it's a question for me, like, is freedom of speech incompatible with market growth? I would like to think not. But I think that maybe is a question that is worth more exploration. Let me turn to the question from the back row. Thank you so much for asking about how I'm theorizing this state. I struggled to try and decide exactly what I should say. I am talking about a vast array of ways that people imagine elected officials and appointed bureaucrats. And so I'm using actually a definition of the state that comes from the Indian Constitution, which is, but I'm also very conscious of the vast literature that has really problematized the state as sort of a kind of, it's not a thing. It's not a thing that you can kind of capture and label. And so what I'm using it to think of all of the kind of individuals who represent the power to utilize government mechanisms to make things happen, whether that's building a road or whether that's getting a government job. And that's at all different levels, at the local level, the district collector, at the state level, the chief minister, other elected, you know, members of the legislative assembly at the state level, as well as the central government. And one of the things that's really impressed me about Indian citizens is how savvy they are about which kinds of activities are going to address which kinds of levels of the government. At one point, I was also thinking about, you know, using the term government because, you know, if I'm talking about elected officials, we're talking about particular elected governments, but it didn't sound as good as the government just doesn't sound as good. So, but I do take your point that the state is not a homogenous thing, and it's standing in for lots of different things. And then the last,
we're almost out of time, so just do you want to just respond quickly? We can continue our discussions over tax.
Yeah.
Who's the threat? Who's closing its space?
Yeah,
Who's closing the spaces? Thank you. So it's interesting because it's always people who've been elected on the basis of the advantages of collective space, who then want to shut them down as soon as they're in power. Now, part of that's because opposition parties often play quite a role in rousing and organizing. It's not always opposition parties, but often it's opposition parties. And so, in the case of KCR, who's the current chief minister of Telangana, he's the one who tried to shut down Government Health, even though those kinds of protests are what got him elected in the first place. In the case of freedom of speech, it's the current government in power at the national level, the BJP, which has done a lot of like the BBC released a documentary that was not flattering for the current prime minister, and it was banned in India. And then immediately after that, the BBC headquarters in Delhi were raided, and with charges of tax evasion. It's often spurious charges. There was just a recent thing with the online media site called NewsClick, and 33 people were arrested because they posted a story that was not complimentary to the current regime.
And the arrests of journalists.
And lots of arrests, lots of journalists imprisoned, lots of civil rights activists imprisoned, including, including people in their 80s who, are in ill health and who've just been held with no charges. There's a long history of anti-terrorism acts. Those got kind of modified in 2019 that made it even easier to hold people without charging them. So they're just held, and they keep having trial dates, and the trials keep getting postponed, and they still.